Hey guys, back at the office today. No hat this time, so I'm showing off the bald head in all its glory, so enjoy that. We're going to pick up where we left off the other day in John 9. We saw Jesus perform the miracle of healing the man who had been born blind. And yeah, some interesting stuff is going to happen now as a result of all that. So let's just jump right in with the story. We're going to be starting in verse 13.
They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not of God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was a division among them. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes?" He said, "He is a prophet."
So the Pharisees call this guy in, and they're questioning him. And he's telling them his story. And they're criticizing Jesus once again for doing a miracle on the Sabbath. And he's already called them out for their hypocrisy on doing things on the Sabbath. A little while earlier in John, we read that before. And here, the man says he is a prophet. And later on in this chapter, he's going to claim that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. But here he calls him a prophet. And we can maybe assume he's saying this because he's in the presence of these Pharisees who he knows are so against Jesus that maybe he's just measuring his words a little bit more carefully here.
The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight, until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind. But how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue.
So these Pharisees are kind of refusing to believe that this miracle has actually happened. And they're kind of seeking to disprove it a little bit. So they bring his parents in. They bring this man's parents in. And they say, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? Like, that you claim?" And they say, "Yeah, this is our son. He was born blind. We don't know how he sees. We don't know who opened his eyes. But yes, that's him, and he used to be blind." So they testify that, yes, that's our son. He used to be blind. Now he sees. We don't know how that happened. But yeah, that's true. And then we see a little bit here, his parents are worried about speaking too openly about this. And they say, "Why don't you just go ahead and talk to him? He's old enough to talk to you about this himself. He doesn't need us." Because again, they knew how the Pharisees felt about Jesus. And they feared the consequences of what might come upon them if they were to proclaim that it was Jesus who healed their son.
Therefore his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So for the second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have already told you, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" And they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from."
These Pharisees, they still don't want to believe it. And so they're asking him again, "Okay, how did this happen? Tell us again, how did it happen?" And he says, "Guys, I already told you. And you wouldn't listen then, so why do you want me to tell you again?" And the man kind of, sarcastically asks him, "Hey, do you want to be his disciples too? Is that why you're asking so much about him?" And that set them off, and then they just hurl an insult right back at him. You are his disciple. We're disciples of Moses. And you can imagine them being really puffed up about that.
The man answered, "Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and you would teach us?" And they cast him out.
It kind of seems like this man was pretty quick-witted. The Pharisees throw an insult at him, and then he just comes right back with, "Man, this is amazing. You don't know where this guy comes from, and yet he opened my eyes." He said, "This has never happened before. Never since the world began have the eyes of the blind been opened. If this man was not from God, he would not be able to do this." Like, he's just reasoning with these Pharisees who ultimately don't want to hear it. And they throw him out. Next time we're going to see what happens after this guy gets tossed out of the temple. And that's going to really wrap up this story here in chapter 9. So that's all we're going to get to this time. We'll finish up chapter 9 next time. We'll see you guys then.